So up to now you've solved quadratics by solving for the square, taking the square root of both sides, remember the plus or minus, giving us two answers. But there are other ways to solve quadratics too, several. And another method we commonly use on the easier ones is by factoring. But it's been a little while since we factored, so let's do a quick review of greatest common factor and standard form factoring. Greatest common factor, or GCF as we call it, is when two terms have something in common. Like in this case, the x squared has two x's and the 6x has an x, so they have an x in common. And what we're doing is using the distributive property to undistribute that x, take it out of both, and then we think distributive property and ask ourselves, what do we take x by, what do we multiply x by to get x squared? Well, that's another x. X times x is x squared. And what do we multiply x by to get 6x? Well, that is the 6. So that's a greatest common factor. It's what they have in common. One more. If I had x squared plus 8x, I can see again they both have an x in common. I can pull that x out, and x times x gives me x squared, and x times 8 gives me 8x. One other type of factoring you did was standard form factoring. Standard form. What made standard form was the fact that it had three terms, like x squared plus 5x plus 6. And what we tried to do is find what two things FOIL, multiply out to x squared plus 5x plus 6. Well, we know when we FOIL that x times x makes that x squared. We know when we FOIL that this number times this number makes positive 6. So the signs are either two positives or two negatives. In this case, since the middle's a plus, it's got to be the two positives. I need two numbers that multiply to 6. That's 1 and 6, or 2 and 3. But when you FOIL and you multiply and you add the two things to make the middle term, they make 5x. And I noticed that 2 and 3 add to 5. So if I FOIL this, x times x is x squared, x times 3 is 3x, that's the outside, 2 times x is 2x, and the 2x and the 3x, when you add them together, make 5x, and then 2 times 3 makes the 6. One more, let's change the signs. X squared minus 8x minus 12. Actually, let's do plus 12. So in this case, I know that x times x makes x squared. I know that this number times this number makes positive 12. So those two numbers multiply to positive 12. It's either two positives or two negatives. Since the middle's a minus, it's got to be the two negatives. I need factors of 12, and they have to add to 8. Well, factors of 12 are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. And the two that add to 8 are 2 and 6. One last example. X squared minus 3x minus 18. X times x makes x squared. This number times this number makes negative 18. Since those two numbers multiply to negative 18, one's got to be positive and the other sign's got to be negative, because a positive times a negative will make negative 18. I need two numbers that multiply to 18, but since one is positive and one is negative, when I add the two numbers together to make the middle term, one will be positive, one will be negative, and I'll end up subtracting them to make negative 3. Factors of 18 are 1 and 18, 2 and 9, and 3 and 6. And notice that 3 and 6 subtract to 3. And really they don't subtract to 3, they really add to negative 3. I have to make 3 and 6 add to negative 3 with my positive and negative signs. Well, notice that negative 6 and positive 3 add to negative 3. So if I FOIL that out, I'll get x squared minus 3x minus 18. So the reason we needed to review factoring is we're now going to use factoring to solve quadratics. And usually, just like what we did when we solved for the square and did the plus or minus, there are going to be two answers. It's possible they could both be positive or both be negative, or one positive, one negative. Depends on the question. But these first ones are all greatest common factor. The rule is, when you solve by factoring, is it must be equal to 0. Because we use that idea in order to find the answers. And all we do is we factor. Look at the x squared and the 10x. They have an x in common. So if I pull that x out, x times x is x squared, and x times 10 is 10x. Now this is equal to 0, and this is very important because we're going to use the idea that if two numbers multiplied make 0, the answers, the solutions come from when those factors are 0. See, if this was 0, 0 times whatever this is going to be 0. 0 times anything is 0. And whatever this is, if this factor was 0, whatever that is times 0, again will be equal to 0. So what you do is you ask yourself, what x do I plug in that creates 0? Right here, what could I plug in for x that would make 0? Well, x equals 0. That would work. Because if I put 0 there, and I put it here too, 0 plus 10, and I took 0 times 0 plus 10, I would get 0. So 0 is one solution. So the other answer occurs from what x do I plug in that makes x plus 10 0. So what do you plug in here for x that creates 0? Well, really we're solving an equation. We're going, all right, what do I put in for x that x plus 10 becomes 0? Well, I'll take a 10 off each side. I can see that x would be negative 10. In other words, if I plugged in negative 10 for x, negative 10 plus 10 would be 0, and 0 times whatever this is over here doesn't even matter. 0 times anything is going to be 0. So the other answer from this factor is x equal negative 10. And what you'll discover here that this goes very quickly. Let's try another one. X squared minus 6x equals 0. It must be equal to 0 for this to work. So I'm going to factor it. They both have an x in them. It'll be x times x minus 6 equals 0. There are two solutions because there are two factors. One solution here because I plug a number in for x and I can create 0. One solution for this factor because I can put a number in for x and create 0. So right here, if I put in 0, I get 0 times whatever x minus 6 is, and 0 times anything is 0. For the other one, and you can do this in your head, I realize, but you're solving an equation. What makes x minus 6 0? Add 6 to both sides, and I see that x would be 6. In other words, if I put in 6 for x right there, 6 minus 6 creates 0, and 0 times anything is 0. So x equals 6. And when you put these in WAMAT for your solutions, put your two answers, either order, doesn't matter. Put 0 and then a comma and 6. Here it would have been 0, comma, negative 10. This next one is x times x plus 5. And the two numbers that create 0 are x equals 0 and x equals negative 5. Because negative 5 plus 5 is 0. So 0, comma, negative 5 are the solutions. Standard form. This one's a little bit tougher, and partially because these numbers here are larger, but this is good for us. I'll put a link on the calendar and I'll try to remember to put it in the WAMAP assignment. But there is a Google factor table spreadsheet I created that'll give you these factors very quickly. You could also use some of the pages we've used earlier, like on mathisfun.com, the thing that generates factors. But I'll show you what this looks like with the Google factor table. But I'm going to factor this with standard form, and I need two numbers that multiply to 44 right here, but when I add them they make negative 15. Remember that x times x is x squared. This number times this number makes positive 44. So my signs are either two positives to make positive 44 or two negatives. Since this sign is negative, it's going to be two negatives. Two numbers that multiply to 44 but add to 15. I think I can do this in my head. This would be 4 times 11 is 44. And notice that 4 and 11, negative 4 and negative 11 actually, add to negative 15. And then just like the last few we've done, we can look and see the answer. What do I plug in for x that creates 0? Well, that would be 4. 4 minus 4 is 0. What do I put in for x here that creates 0? That would be 11, because 11 minus 11 is 0. So my answers are 4, and 11. This next one, I need factors of 120 that add to negative 22. That's a little tougher. But I know it's going to be x and x. I know that this number times this number makes positive 120. So my signs are either two positives or two negatives. It's going to be two negatives because this sign is a minus. And let's look at the factor table. We were looking for factors of 120 that add to 22. And I can see right here that they are 10 and 12. So 10 and 12, negative 10 plus negative 12 makes negative 22, and negative 10 times negative 12 makes positive 120. Now the values I plug in for x that make 0 are 10. If I plug in 10 minus 10, I get 0, and 0 times anything will be 0. The other value that works here is 12, because 12 minus 12, if I put in 12 here, it'll be 12 minus 12 makes 0, and 0 times whatever that is will make 0. So our answers are 10 and 12. For this last one, we know it's going to be x times x to make x squared. We know that this number times this number makes negative 132. It's got to be a positive times a negative. I need factors of 132. One of the factors will be positive and one will be negative. When I add a positive and negative number, they subtract. So I need factors of 132 that subtract to 1. So let's again look at the table. So here in the table, we're looking for two numbers that subtract to 1. And here we can see them. They are 12 and 11, or 11 and 12. So when I place the 11 and the 12, they have to multiply to negative 132, and they subtract to 1, but really they add to negative 1. I have to make 11 and 12 add to negative 1. And I know that negative 12 plus 11 makes negative 1. Now, the solutions come from what value of x you plug in that creates 0. And that would be here, negative 11, because negative 11 plus 11 is 0. And the other answer is going to be x equal 12, because 12 minus 12 is 0. So our answers are negative 11, 12. A few more examples if you need them. Here goes. So this one is going to be x times x is x squared. This number times this number is positive 108. And since this sign is a minus, it's got to be two negatives to make that positive 108. And the two negatives will add to negative 21. I need factors of 108 that add. They'll both be negative. They'll add to negative 21. Let's look at the factor table. So here in the table, we can see that 9 and 12 add to 21. So 9 and 12 are our numbers. So 9 and 12, or 12 and 9, order doesn't matter. What values do you plug in that create 0? Well, 9 minus 9 is 0, and 12 minus 12 is 0. So 9 comma 12 are our answers. This next one, we have different signs. X times x is x squared. This number times this number makes negative 24. So to make negative 24, it's going to take a positive and a negative. I need factors of 24. One factor will be positive, one will be negative. When I add a positive and negative number, I subtract them in my head. I need them to subtract to 2. So it looks like 4 and 6 are our numbers. 4 times 6 is 24. 4 and 6 subtract to 2. Now really, again, I need them to add to negative 2. So to make 4 and 6 add to negative 2, I'm going to have to make it negative 6 and positive 4. And our answers come from what you plug in to make 0. Well, negative 4 plus 4 is 0, and 6 minus 6 is 0. So negative 4 and 6 are our answers. Last one here. X times x is x squared. This number times this number makes positive 84. So it's either two positives or two negatives. This is a minus, so it's got to be the two negatives. Factors of 84 that add to 19. This is a little tough. You could use the factor table. I believe it ends up being 7 times 12 is 84, and 7 plus 12 is 19. So we get negative 7 and negative 12 are our factors in there. Now the solutions come from what you plug in that creates 0. 7 minus 7 is 0. And what x do I plug in to make 0? Well, here that would be 12. So 7 and 12 are our answers.